Unfortunately, we haven't worked very much in Africa, which I really regret. We have worked in North Africa and Libya, where we still have a program. We have worked in South Africa, but that's it. So we really need to be a bigger force, a bigger presence on the continent for sure. Once we started our programs largely in the Western Balkans, and then we moved our headquarters once we became a treaty-based international organization here in The Hague in 2015. And as soon as we came here, we started having meetings with the African group of countries to raise awareness about the issue of missing persons, to engage them. And one of the reasons we did this is because we're a treaty-based international organization, and all countries are welcome to accede to our treaty. Now, the treaty is not a ban on chemical weapons or something like that. It's a treaty that recognizes the status and functions of ICMP. So many states would say, well, what's in it for us, recognizing ICMP? But in recognizing ICMP, a state that accedes to the treaty, and all they have to do is walk over to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs down the street and deposit an instrument of accession, so it's not too difficult, means that you're recognizing the global nature of missing persons. You're recognizing that your own country has this challenge, and you're entering a club of nations who are taking this issue on board for real. So we would very much welcome, and I want to say this very publicly, to Burundi, to Uganda, and other countries on the African continent, you are welcome to be part of ICMP. We would love this. And it's going to be a lot of work to deal with these issues, but we need to start as soon as possible. Libya established early on a commission on missing persons right after the conflicts ended. And they invited us. I remember having, Skype conversations with the person that was there in 2011. And through that invitation, we began our work. So in the context of Libya, there were persons missing from the 40-year regime of Gaddafi, including wars with Chad, including wars with Egypt. Again, these bilateral issues are very important. And then there were people missing internally. And that as a result of the 2011 conflict, there were an increased number of missing persons. Now, we began working there, and to my surprise, we made a lot of progress. When there's goodwill, and when there's a political will, then you can do things. So there was a political will to move forward. We were able to work very rapidly to help Libya collect genetic reference samples from families of the missing, to create some kind of intergovernmental body. We called it a Libyan Identification Center. So these were nascent efforts to begin training in a process of excavations of mass grave sites, into cause and manner of death, because DNA, of course, can give you the identity, but you don't know who or how, what were the circumstances under which they died. So in the 2 years initially, when we started the program in 2012, we helped Libya find over 150 people. One thing, we've been thinking in the discussions we've had in the African group, let's come in softly. Let's deal with people missing from migration. That's a global problem, and that can involve Europe, and that builds bridges of peace. Let's deal with people missing from the results of global warming, the increased number of floods and, other things that are happening on the African continent where people are increasingly missing, for reasons that have to do with global warming. Let's start with that. Let's build the capacity, for example, of law enforcement to do good things, to help families of the missing, to be first responders in cases where there are natural disasters. We would love to bring people from African countries here to train them on data systems, on how to use DNA to find missing people. I think that would be a door to come in and begin, and then start dealing with the tougher political issues. But I think that to me would be a dream, just to lay the groundwork, that we would at least have a global capacity to deal with at least the people who go missing from these disasters, from migration, and then we go farther in and we start working on really political cases, but also you're training like police forces, but also families of the missing. I mean, here is your door also. The more they understand what the state has to do, the more they're involved. It's not just missing people, you're creating good governance, you're creating the ability for communities to become involved as equal players with the government in the process. So if you build institutions in Africa and African states that can address this issue and create a space for civil society in those structures, you're beginning to build something that goes beyond. And you're also beginning, if we can help law enforcement have these DNA capabilities, data system capabilities, there begins to be trust in institutions in Africa that where maybe there was mistrust before. So even if we work with the state, we're going to work with civil society. I mean, we want to be a bridge that brings everyone together. But when one part of that bridge doesn't want to do anything, then all your forces go into civil society. And that's the key here. And civil society have to be loud, have to have a voice, have to be, but often they're afraid. So this can be very, very difficult. And we work with Syrian families, for example, they're terrified. By its nature, this issue requires cooperation. It's just by its nature, because you don't know. Were they missing from a flood? Were they missing from, like the earthquake, like we were talking the other day, the earthquake in Syria? Were they missing from the earthquake? Were they missing from enforced disappearance? Were they missing in a boat? You don't know anymore. So cooperation, data systems, and you with your IT background, this is a global world. Uganda is dealing also with, a globalized situation, which it cannot completely control. But it can control building the requisite capabilities to address this issue. And I think that's where we fail, even in Europe. We're not building these institutions. Families of the missing have information, but they don't have the whole picture. So it's like pieces of a puzzle that you have to put together. Then you have contemporary cases, and then you have historical legacies also of missing persons, like Spain, for example, that has a legacy of missing persons, or Burundi. All countries have legacy issues. The North America has legacies of indigenous people who've gone missing. And then higher numbers of minority groups. People who are of color, people who are migrants in North America, their cases are not investigated in the same way as other cases because there's discrimination. And that exists everywhere. So it's very hard to get accurate numbers. But in the Western Balkans, because of all the work we did, and today in Syria, or maybe tomorrow in Ukraine, there's an ability to have higher numbers. But it would be great if on the African continent, in order to take this seriously, we have to raise awareness about this issue. And it is, unfortunately, the victims and the survivors of these cases. And victims by those who have missing children who may be alive, but they're a victim. The survivor is the person searching for them. That would be another dream, to bring those survivors together from around the world and make them a force to address this issue. That would be cool. That would be amazing. In my opinion, this issue of justice is extremely important. I worry about double standards. I don't want to see, I personally think it's wrong in Europe and in North America, for example, that people of different races, different groups are treated differently. And if we have a situation in, an African country or an Asian country or a Latin American country that, we're going to pursue customary justice as opposed to, these are big debates. But in the case of missing persons, these are crimes, and how one is going to deal with these crimes, especially when the scale is huge. And I think in the discussion last night, especially if it's a genocide, yes, there has to be, justice. But where do you draw that line? These are open questions that we as society have to look at. It's 2023, and the world has changed. And African countries need to debate this as well. Rwanda is a particular example. But the truth about what happened is so critical. And I can tell you, had we not used DNA on the cases in Srebrenica, where we identified now almost 90% of the victims of a genocide and provided that evidence in court, there would still be a huge debate. And even those who say that now are, they're the same people who say the earth is flat. The denial, the deniers will always be there. But we have profound evidence, which was provided, irrefutable evidence that was provided in an international court. And that truth has to come out. Only 65 countries in the world have ratified the Convention on the Protection of Persons from Disappearances. So that means, that's not even half of the world. Not even half of the countries in the world have ratified that particular agreement. So we do work in countries where that have done neither. In the case of the Philippines, we have worked there before. We worked on Typhoon Frank. There was a big typhoon. I mean, again, natural disasters are a way in because then there's unity here. And we were able to find quite a number of people who died in that particular typhoon together with colleagues from Interpol. We worked jointly, and that would be, a really good thing to have this platform that is able to respond. When it comes to these particular cases of human rights abuses and so on, we have not. And again, the ideal situation is we're invited by the government. That would be the ideal situation. So they don't need to be a member state. They don't need to have ratified the Convention on the Protection of Persons from Enforced Disappearances, but we do need an invitation. Now, if we don't have an invitation, going down the line of options here, we can work with civil society. And that's where I'm saying if there's no political will to address these issues, then we can work with civil society. And the final thing is then we have to put together a proposal for funding. Okay? And then we depend on the goodwill of a limited number of countries in the world who provide these donations. And make no mistake, those countries who provide those donations also have political motivations. So, right now we have funding for Ukraine, which is great, and that's extremely important. But again, getting funding for other parts of the world is complicated. When a state ratifies the convention, that's not joining ICMP, it still has to create implementing legislation, in its own. So there's a good side to this because it's ratified it and it joins a club of nations. So we try to help states create that implementing legislation. So that's good. And in our opinion, also, the convention doesn't go far enough because it's only dealing with enforced disappearance. So while that's good, there are other cases of missing persons in all of these countries I've just mentioned. How do you deal with missing migrants then? And how do you know whether the migrant was forcibly disappeared or not? The key here is to make law enforcement better. You can't just keep going around these things. You have to at some point say the prosecutor's office, law enforcement, judges, all these things, if there's discrimination in the system, you can't turn a blind eye and create another system. The states understand that this is not a threat. This is a good thing. To do these investigations allows states to grow up and to stop this, killing, and to stop this disappearances and to stop harming. And people in every country just want a normal life, So, I think if they stop seeing it as a threat, and that's where we try to come in. We don't try to, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International do an amazing work. And are constructively critical, and they need to be. Our work is more, we're intergovernmental, so we're trying to build that. We're trying to find that goodwill and build on it, and say, this is not a threat. This is good for you. You need to build these institutions. You need to find these missing people because you'll be a better country if you do these things. If you don't do this, you will continue cycles of violence again, forever and ever and ever. And I think you as journalists and civil society, you need to approach it this way. Why is this constantly seen as a threat? If you can convince governments that actually this is to your benefit to do something like this, it's not going to